All right. This is the story of Nico Robin. It's told by Darius the Green Angel. All right. So Nico Robin is, you know, a girl. She had a mom named Olvia. Olvia Nico Olvia. She was an archaeologist, but she had to go out to sea. She left Robin when she was about, I don't know, 3, 4, 5 years old. She was really young. She had to live with her aunt and uncle. Um, they had other children. It was like tough for them or something. Not really. They didn't treat Robin equally and shit. But Robin had O'Hara. That was the island she lived on. This island was full of scholars. This island was full of scholars and shit. These scholars, had knowledge on the ancient past. Shit that the government didn't want people to know about. Void Century. In an ancient kingdom. Dr. Clover or or Cloud D Clover, a D member. he no he he tried to he tried to find out things about the history of the world when he was younger. He collected a lot of books, and then like other people who were like interested in questioning things too. Why is this like this? Why do these people get you know you know enslaved? Why do people just disappear? And then why are these things being built? Why can't we do this? Why do we have to heed calls to this? Why do all these islands have to heed calls to just the world government? What does that mean? All kind of questions in like this ancient kingdom. Why were they like erased from existence, or like anything of them? And why do these poneglyphs exist? The One Piece and all that shit. O'Hara like was trying to figure out the mysteries of the world through the past, and they wanted to enlighten the world to this history. Olvia was out at sea trying to collect information. That's Robin's mom, right? But Nico Robin, the whole time for like I don't know 5 years, she learned how to read and do shit with the or read poneglyphs and other things. They were like, eventually they were like, Robin, you're a scholar of O'Hara, just like the rest of us, because you always sneak into the library to try to learn or read books. And she was like, it's interesting stuff. And then Clover was like, yeah, that's cool. You have to be like us. Um, One day she meets a giant named Jaguar D. Saw, another D member, comes into Nico Robin's life. And at the end of the video, I'll say some shit about what I think about Nico Robin. But Saul, Jaguar D. Saw is there on the island. But he wasn't trying to go there necessarily. He was there, and he was like, he asked Robin, he was like, you're a little girl, what island am I? She's like, this is Ohara. And he was like, oh no, the government's coming to attack your people. You guys got to get the fuck out of here. It's not going to be safe. They got Navy vessels they're going to surround the island, and there'll be nothing left. You guys got to get out of here. As this was going on, Olvia returns to the island. Robin doesn't quite remember her mom. Like I said, she left Robin when she was like 3 or 4. And Robin's like 8 years old now, 9 years old now, something like that. She comes back and she tells Clover that, yes, they found, this and that about the blank century. And they were like, he's like, you've done great work for us. Getting evidence that the, world government is playing games and shit. Right? And she's like, yes, this and that. But as they were there, Cypherpole found him too. Savandum's father, I believe he was in command of Cypherpole 5 back in those days. And he said, you know, we're going to call in a buster call since the 5 elders are on the phone. They were talking to Clover and they said, the Void Century shouldn't be talked about. We don't need people knowing about that. You've dug a little bit too deep into things that we don't need you to. This will compromise the organization we call the world government. The world's balance will then be out of balance as far as they're concerned, but they have their own agendas, not so great agenda for the world to keep people blind and lies told to them. But the government didn't care. They're like, you know what? We're calling in that buster call. It's fine. Destroy O'Hara. They called in a buster call, and vice admirals with fleets of ships, to destroy an island. Boom, boom, boom. Cannon fire all over the island. Olvia and then eventually ended up dead, but she, Robin asked her, "Are you my mom?" And she was like, "No, I'm not your mother." She did that to try to save Robin. As if the Cypher Pool member found out that Nico Robin was her daughter, Robin would be like, executed right there on the spot. And that guy was like, do you have a child? Is that your child? And she was like, no, that's not my child. But it was pretty evident that she was because they looked very similar. Olvia had white hair. Jaguar D Saw said, Robin, you gotta run. You gotta get the fuck out of here. Whatever happens to this people, you need to live on. You're the future. She was like the youngest person on the island, or one of them. He was like, you gotta get the fuck out of here. And he tried to, hold people back and other things. But eventually, Aokiji got to the island, and Aokiji at the time was a vice admiral, and he was like, Jaguar D Saw, you used to be a part of the government. You were, in our ranks, but now you're, a fucking pirate, I guess. Going against, what we have to do here. We have to destroy this island. We have to destroy all these people too. You know, Akahina was also there, and he destroyed a ship full of people who were trying to escape. Um, and Aokiji saw that, and he was like, he looked at Robin, and he looked at Saul, and he was like, you know what? Ice time. I'm gonna freeze you. Jaguar D saw that is, and he was like, don't worry, Robin. You'll find friends one day and other things, but it'll be hard, for a while until then. And he he froze. Her mom was dead. Dr. Clover died too. Cypherpole agents killed all of them. Then, they were throwing books into the water to try to save them. Or, like, eventually somebody could come around and pick these books up from the bottom of the ocean. Because the island was burning down. And then everybody, died. That was there. Nobody could escape. And these people were innocent. These were just scholars, people trying to learn things about the past, learn things about each island, and different things that were being hidden from people, And then Aokiji eventually, he came to the decision that it's all right for her to live for now. She's just a girl, you know, and he like let her escape on a boat. Then for years, Robin ran around like everywhere, but she had a bounty on her head of 79 million. People were like, this little girl right here has a bounty of 79 million. Robin couldn't like stay anywhere too long. She was always on the run, being hunted down by the government. She, she tried to stay here or there. She ran around for a long time by herself. Like 20 years, in fact. She got to, you know, eventually she got to Crocodile. Crocodile was one of the seven warlords of the sea. And he ran a group called Baroque Works. See, Nico Robin was a part of Baroque Works there. As his right hand girl, if you want to, you know, he knew that Nico Robin knew how to read ancient poneglyphs. He was like, I knew how to read this thing. You know, I could be of help to you. You know, and he was like, you know, I have, you know, this because he's like a privateer for the government. You know, but he still fucks around and does what he does. You know, as long as he, you know, assembles with the warlords when he has to, you know, it's cool. And so what he was doing was, you know, trying to take over a kingdom called Alabasta. And she had the code name Miss All Sunday. And she was the right hand, right hand woman of Crocodile. She was the only one that saw Crocodile every day. Everybody else in Brokeworks, you know, saw him every once in a while. But she went out and she found the Straw Hats at Whiskey Peak. He was like, here, take this to Nanohana. It's one of the ports in Alabasta that they could go to. However, I don't know, Luffy knew that something was weird going on there, and also that he didn't want her, like, throwing them off course. Luffy's like, we decided to go to fucking Little Garden, because that's where we want to go. That's where I want to go. You don't get to steer this ship. She was like, okay, you know, whatever. You know, she left, you know, and other things. She was riding on a turtle. She actually shot down Igaram too, who was one of Vivi's trusted, you know, bodyguards, you know, and that's why Luffy was mad at her. You know, you killed that guy, and he was not that bad of a guy. You know, she was like, all right, whatever. You know, she got out of there. Then she showed up again at rain dinners with Crocodile. You know, in Alabasta when they finally got there. Um, there she was just, you know, watching Crocodile, you know, make orders, you know, saying, you know, I'm going to take over Alabasta, you know, there's nothing you can do to stop me. He told Bibby that. Bibby tried to cut his head off and nothing happened, you know, as he's made of sand and other shit. Then, you know, Luffy left his crew so he could fight Crocodile in the desert. And he fought Crocodile in the desert, but Crocodile buried him. However, Nico Robin was the one who saved him from dying, pulled him out of the ground. Pell was like, huh? You know, why would you save this man? She didn't even know herself. But deep inside, she knew that that guy had the will of D. You know, she knew of, like, the will of D, and she knew that those people were interesting. She didn't know exactly what it meant, but, like, anybody who had D in their name was, you know, something interesting to her. And she would try to figure some shit out eventually, as she's an archaeologist, and she's interested in learning about the past. To get to Albarna with Crocodile, they take King Cobra down to, you know, the ruins in Alabasta Kingdom. However, Luffy also, you know, got defeated by Crocodile again. However, he was dried up. You know, like, dehydrated like a motherfucker, to the point he was, like, almost dead. But water came down and got Luffy right. Rehydrated him. However, he goes into he goes into the you know, Valley of the Kings, where, you know, all the poneglyphs and shit were, you know, and Crocodile is like, read this poneglyph. This has the ancient weapon Pluton. It has information about where it's located. It's on this island somewhere, isn't it? He asked her, and she was like, no, it doesn't have anything about that on here. She can read it and other things. And he was like, she's like, it's only about, the ancient kings he used to rule over Alabasta. And he was like, this don't sound right. He cut her. Well, she tried to, like, cut him. She tried to throw water on him and cut him. But then, she got stabbed. Then Luffy ended up fighting. She was kind of like, I'm going to die here. There's no reason to, like, live anymore. you know. But after Luffy defeated Crocodile, he was like, nah, I'm taking you and this king and we're getting the fuck out of here. You saved me from the sand, so I might as well save you too. You can't be that bad. And so he saved her. When the Straw Hats left Alabasta, she was just on the ship. She was like, I'm joining your crew now, if that's all right with you, Captain. She was being very clever and smart. And Luffy was like, okay, cool. And they were like, what? Everybody in the crew was like, huh? She just gets to join. Sanji was all right with it. Zoro had his, and Usopp. And, Nami was, a bit like, it's all right. There's another girl. Chopper was a little bit afraid, but, she was all right. She was just reading books and other shit. Then they made their way towards Jaya. And there, Nico Robin was like, Sky Island probably does exist, but we have to, like, find information to get there. I don't mind being the one to, like, help you out, look for the information to get us to Sky Island. Because she likes to discover things too. You know, and she listened to Mont Blanc Nolan about his, Nolan the liar, that story about his ancestor, or Mont Blanc Cricket, my bad. Mont Blanc Cricket talking about Mont Blanc Nolan. Mont Blanc Nolan wasn't really a liar. People had played games with the Mont Blanc name. And people in the community they were playing games with his name. And that's what happened, So Mont Blanc then, um, told them the story, I think, my ancestor did see the city of gold. It's like either up there in the sky, get shot up with the knockup stream or something like that, or it's at the bottom of the sea. City of Shandor, the city of gold. And he got his head chopped off basically because he lied to the king about it. But he actually wasn't lying. And Nico Robin was like, that's interesting. I think it possibly exists too. It's definitely a possibility. We have to figure out what this knockup stream does and other things. Mont Blanc cricket then enlightened them to, you need a songbird or one of those like singing bird things. You gotta take that with you so it can like tell you where the knockup string is and like get you to the right one so you can go up there. And like, because some of these knockup strings you can't get up there, right? And it won't stay. The water won't blast up long enough. So then when it blasts you up, then you will come back down and hit the water and, your ship will capsize. It'll be destroyed basically. But they found the right knockup stream the next day. And then they got to Skypiea. There she was, looking around, she saw a new world and she was like, damn, this island does exist. I never thought I'd be here, but, because of Luffy, I'm here. She saw this shit. Um, Eventually, Gonfall shows up, and she and Gonfall talk at a fire because Gonfall had fought against Shura, but he lost. He had injured himself, and then Chopper, patched him up. She was like, talking to him about an ancient, warrior, sun god Nika a little bit, and she was like, huh, Nika, I think I remember hearing that about that on some like, things, but I don't know what it's about, She eventually found, poneglyphs as well that had Gold Roger's name etched in it. It says, I'm Gold Roger, I was here. the One Piece. We're on our way to find, all kind of shit. But it was etched on the side of it. You know, she saw that and she was like, "Damn, this is like important." You know, for the journey. She fought against a guy who wanted her not to see that. This guy was like a fat buck who like worked for Anaru. She had to like put him on fucking, you know, she rolled him off a fucking cliff. She broke his back. He got fucked up. But then she was one of the people who like had to stand on business against Anaru. It was her, Zoro, Gonfall, and Wiper. All four of them were like standing in front of him, and he was like, okay, and she like, they played games, or well, he was really playing games with them. He allowed them all to hit him with one attack, and they basically knocked him out or almost killed him. But he hit himself with lightning, and he came back. He shot Nico Robin with one like lightning bolt, and she was done. She then like woke up later and other things. Luffy run up Giant Jack and gave NL the what for. Hit the golden bell to let Mont Blanc cricket know that it is up here and it does exist. The city of gold, Chandora, does exist for real. And he was like, yeah, that's great to know it's there. You know, then Skypiea was saved and the Chandorians got to land back. But then they went back down. Long ring, long land happened. Long ring, long land happened, and a Davy back fight with Foxy Pirate. Foxy was playing games. Wait a minute, what the fuck? Did I? Damn, I don't think I posted that video. I should have posted that video. Damn. I'll have to get that next week or on Sunday. I just remembered something, but oh wait a minute, no, I did. What the hell? Um, but hmm. They do that Davy back fight, and she got taken over to Fox's crew, because Luffy lost her in the Davy back fight. But then he like it was like multiple challenges and shit, so he was able to get him back, win all of his crew members back. Um, but then they got to another island, and a guy showed up. Um, Admiral Aokiji from Navy HQ, and he was like, I'm not here to do anything. No need to get worried. Robin got really shook. She was like, oh, fuck, that's Aokiji. She hadn't seen him in like 20 years, and this nigga was back. And she was like, because like what she remembers is, O'Hara burning up, everybody she knows dying, and then him saying, get out of here before I change my mind. That's what she remembered. She started having like panic attacks and shit. Like, you guys gotta like, this guy's not, somebody we can fight against. This guy is actually a fucking real badass and stuff. You know, and then she got froze, and he was like, this girl is like, wanted by the government. I don't think you Straw Hats understand, the danger she poses to the world, as far as if you're fucking around with this girl, they'll have people on your dick at all times. They'll be sending Marines after you to the end of the world. Luffy said, I don't give a fuck. That's my crew member. He told them to leave, and like he would fight out Kiji. Chopper put her in the bath, and she fucking, she got unthawed. Eventually Luffy got, frozen too, but then Aokiji left because he knew about Garp and, his relationship with Luffy. And he was like, I ain't gonna kill my sensei's, grandson. I'll let him live for now. You know, but then Luffy got to, or they got to Water 7. When they got to Water 7, Nico Robin was shopping with Sanji. She tried to put that thought about Aokiji to the back of her head. However, things didn't go that well. As Bluno from CP9 appeared in the form of a bear, in a bear mask. So he said that he told her, he said, um, you have to, like, you know, come with me. There's no running anymore. The government's been after you for years. You have nowhere to run and other things. And she was like, oh fuck. And she was like, sorry, Sanji, our path ends here. I have to leave. And Sanji was like, no, what do you mean? And she left with Bruno. Then papers the next day, after Usopp left the crew, um, said that Nico Robin had shot Iceberg in his home. And she did, but she was there with CP9, so she had to do something. They wanted the Pluton. They wanted the blueprints of Pluton. And he had them. But, or he didn't have them. He gave them to Cunning Flame. He gave them to Frankie. But then the next night, they show up there and, they're like, Nico Robin came to do the job again, like to try to finish it. But, Lucci and Bluno and Kaku and Cauliflower were there. So they were there, right? And then, after they were there, after they were there, after they were there, um, Nico Robin was, you know, there too. She was there too. But they got away. They got out the window. Lucci took her and they left. He's like, "You're going to the Tower of Justice. You're going through those gates, and then you'll be executed. We came here to do a job, and you will die." He kept filling her head with all this negative shit. You've evaded the government for this long, but now it's your head, bitch. And he kept like running his fucking mouth like that, to try to break her fucking spirit. She was on the train, and Usopp was there, and Usopp was like, "Hey, come here. We'll get the fuck off of here." They tried to make an escape with Robin while they were on the ship. Sanji and Usopp and Frankie were there. But then Bluno popped up. And Bluno took her through the door and was like, "You can't run away from the power of the government. That's a power that you can't, and you already know, Nico. They were able to destroy your home. You can't go against shit like that and hope to, win." And, she left. She was just like, "I can't win. You guys should leave me alone and just, get out of here." Um, but eventually they all got to Enies lobby and they met, they infiltrated Enies lobby and they were like, Luffy was like, "Tell me you want to fucking live." Nico Robin's life flashed before her eyes and she was like, she remembers Saul's words and she was like, "I do want to live. I don't want to die." And Luffy heard that and that's all he needed to hear. And he's like, "That's my girl. That's my archaeologist. I gotta save this girl. Make sure she's cool. Because she's cool. We need her. You know." And then they all fought CP9 members. She was being walked around by fucking, goddamn that bitch named fucking Spondum. He was walking her fucking around, beating up on her and shit. She was trying to like bite on shit to like make sure she doesn't get taken away. She's like, "I don't want to go," and but then Frankie ended up saving her, punching her and then taking the fucking cuffs off her, and then she like used her flower fruit and like broke his neck, you know. Then she was back on her shit. Um, she watches Luffy defeated Lucci, and then she was the one who like rolled Luffy back to the crew and was like, "Thanks for saving me, Captain." And he was like, "Yeah, no problem." You know. Then the Mary got burned down, and they all cried about that. Then they got to Thriller Bark next. And Thriller Bark, Nico Robin was, with Chopper, Nami. It wasn't Chopper. They're trying to fight against Zoro and Sanji's shadow. They were possessing these fucking animal things, like these fucked up corpses that were made by Hogback. And that happened, right? And that happened, right? So then, fucking, he she was trying to hold down these zombies so that, because when they put salt in their mouth, the shadow comes out. You put salt in the zombie's mouth, and the shadow comes out of the body. Um, the zombie's body, the corpse, and then the shadow's just there, and it can go back to its owner. And she was trying to get the fucking salt pellets in his mouth, and she was able to do that eventually. And Zoro tried to get the shadow back. But you know, he was there to fucking help against ores and whatnot. Um, and she was there. She was using her flower fruit to try some shit, but her powers were kind of like not useless, but like barely did much. But then after Kuma and or after Moria and Ors were defeated, right? Kuma showed up, and after Ursa shock happened, they were all knocked out. She was knocked out too. So she woke up the next day, and Luffy was better, and she was like, "Huh, that's crazy. Luffy would like should be more tired than that." You know, he fought against Moria and Ors. He took a lot of pain, but then Zoro showed back up, and he was all fucking bloody and shit. It's because of what Kuma did. But they get to Sabaody, and then Sabaody, Robin's there. Luffy hits the Celestial Dragon, right? I feel like trying to say Kimi from the slave auction. Kami's that mermaid that Hachan liked, and everybody liked Hachan because he wasn't the Arlong anymore. He hits the Celestial Dragon in the face, but then Rayleigh comes out. When Rayleigh comes out, Rayleigh's like, "Let's leave and go to my place." He goes to this place, and then she's like, "Did you like?" Nico Robin's like, "Did you guys find the One Piece? Is that true? Did you guys know anything about the Ancient Kingdom and like the Void Century?" She's like, "Yes." Or Rayleigh's like, "Yes, we know all about that stuff. The shit that the government's trying to hide, the One Piece, all of it. The bad shit, the good shit, and all of it." But Luffy was like, "We don't need to know about the journey or anything. We are trying to do this ourselves, you know, and the One Piece, we'll find it ourselves." And Rayleigh was like, "I can't, stop you from doing your thing." And they did that. So then Robin, and the rest of the crew, Kuma, well, Pacifista showed up, and she helped against the Pacifista. They all jumped this Pacifista and tried to, destroy. They had it malfunctioning, so it started shooting lasers everywhere, like. But then Kuma showed up and boom, destroyed it. Then he started sending everybody everywhere. She was the last one to go, actually, out of everybody. You know, he tried to grab Nico Robin, because he sent everybody else, and then she was like, "Luffy," and then Luffy tried to save Robin, but it was too late. And then Luffy had none of his, crew. However, Robin got sent to a place called Tequila Wolf. Now they didn't drink; they weren't drinking on tequila there. Believe that. Now they needed some tequila. That's what they needed, actually, y'all, and that's not bullshit. Because these people were basically slaves forced to build a bridge to nowhere. They have been building this bridge for like 800 years. They were being whipped. They were, building this bridge in the cold. When people died, they still had to work. They threw the dead bodies off the bridge and all kind of shit. Fucked up work. Slave labor and shit. And she was there. She showed, or she, this girl was like doing art, and she was like, one day I want to see these islands and shit. And Nico Robin was like, okay, that's cool. One day I hope you do get to see these islands. She got, bitched at by the other inmates or the, slave inmates, whatever, who were building the bridge and shit. And they were like, that's that bitch right there who was like, filling that girl's head full of like, false dreams. She'll never leave this island. None of us are. But then just when that happened, a couple days later or whatever, revolutionaries come and they try to free the people of Tequila Wolf. And they're like, we come here to save you people from slavery. We heard about, what was going on here. We know that this shit's not cool. That's the government playing games. We're here to help you out. Then Robin was with the revolutionaries for a while. And now she was with the revolutionaries, she trained with Hack, a fishman. She trained in just fishman jiu-jitsu. She learned armament hockey and shit with the fishman. But she also learned things from Sabo and Koala. These were revolutionaries she hung out with for the 2-year time skip. Then she went back to Sabaody 2 years later, and she was cool. She was like, "Hey, Luffy, we can get back on an adventure. I can find Poneglyphs and we can find the One Piece." He's like, "Yeah, of course." That's what we're doing this shit. And then and then they went to Fishman Island after Luffy destroyed some pacifistas and shit. Um, and in Fishman Island, Robin showcased her powers. She did improve. Like she was able to summon big ass legs. Instead of just hands, you can summon like legs. Um, Big legs, the size of like tall buildings and shit. And she was destroying some fish pen. Then they made it to Punk Hazard. And Punk Hazard, she got off the ship with Usopp, Zoro, and Luffy. They found a head named Kinemon, and then he was like, "Yo, Momonosuke, that's my son." They started trying to help him look for his son. In doing that, they found kids and other shit, right? But she got knocked out with knockout gas like Luffy. Her, um, Luffy, Traffy, Trafalgar Law, Smoker, and they all got like nabbed by Caesar, and they were in a cage. But then Law was able to get him out of it. Then Luffy went to go fight Caesar. Law went to go find Virgo. Smoker, and then Nico Robin was just there with the rest of the crew trying to help the kids. And that was her role during that arc. Then they got to Dressrosa, and in Dressrosa, she was running around with Law in Green Bit. It was her, Usopp, and Kinemon was there too. I think no, Kinemon was with other people. But she eventually found the Tontadas. And the Tontadas told them about, how the kingdom used to be cool when King Riku ruled. Riku said cool. The Tontadas was a small little people. And like they could like run around and do stuff. When King Riku was around. However, they started enslaving our people once, Don Quixote del Flamingo came back and took over the kingdom. Because back in the day, like a long time ago, like the Don Quixotes actually ruled over that place. That's why Doflamingo came back to the kingdom to like try to like rule over it again. But they were like, this shit's crazy. This boy is like fucking around with people's lives. Um, King Riku needs to be, the king again. And she was like learning that shit, and she was like, okay, we'll help you get your, kingdom back from Doflamingo. And then Usopp and Robin led a horde of, Tontaras and shit. She ended up helping out Bartolomeo against, what's his name? Gladys, I think. He uses the pop fruit. Yeah, she was able to hold down with that guy, a little bit. Then he was on the island with Luffy. But, they got out of the, they got off the island and they went to Zoe. When they got to Zoe, and they met the rest of the crew members. However, the rest of the crew wasn't there. Sanji was gone, and she was like, "Damn, what are we gonna do?" Luffy's like, "I'm gonna go get Sanji with Nami and Chopper and Brook and Pedro and Carrot, and the rest of y'all can go to Wano, Usopp, Zoro, Robin, and Frankie." And I get to Wano, and she's a geisha. See, she's working with, trying to be on, she's trying to get information about for the Akazaya Nine, so they know how the Onigashima raid's gonna go down. As they were having the fire festival and other things, and they planned on dropping Onigashima on top of the fire capital. But she was learning about this through being a geisha and other things too. About like how many people were gonna be there and all kind of shit. How Kaido the Beast Pirates and these other people who are loyal to fucking Kurozumi Orochi, and Kurozumi Orochi was had her as a geisha. She was like, okay, yeah, and she was running around in places she wasn't supposed to, and Oni Waban, ninjas who works for Kurozumi Orochi were like, "You can't be here. You're Nico Robin. You are playing games." And she's like, "Damn, I have to get the fuck out of here." Brooke came to save her, and she got the fuck out of there. They got the fuck out of there, and then they were, they met in Curry, and in Curry, no, in Curry, no, in Curry, they, plotted a plan to, they plotted a plan to, take back, Wano from Kaido's clutches. Um, However, Luffy was in the distance with all. So he thought that his crew was destroyed. Then Luffy fought against Kaido, and the rest of them were like, whatever. Well, they weren't like whatever. They were like, damn, Luffy went to go fight Kaido, but we're all right. Um, Robin and Nami were, relaxing for a little bit while, and this was during the times when they were like fucking around and stuff, basically waiting for Luffy to come back from like Udon. They were getting shit together with like the rest of the samurais and shit so that they could do the Onigashima raid. The day came when they would do the Onigashima raid, and they got to Onigashima. And Onigashima, she got there, she was there, she was part of the, fighting and everything, right? So what happened was, no, what happened was, she ended up finding Sanji. Sanji was in trouble. He got in a trap. So he heard a woman screaming, so he went. But there were these spider bitches who were like tied him up in some spider web. Sandy has a thing where he doesn't hit girls and other things. And but they were beating his ass so much that he might like actually like fucking die. And he was like, "I need help, Robin." And she came there and she helped him out. She got him off the like webs and shit, and she was like, "Okay, get out of here, Sanji. I'm here." And he's like, "Okay, cool." And he got out of there. And then she was like, "Okay, well, let's, hold down." Brooke was there with her. Um, Fucking, what's her name? Black Maria, one of the Toby Ropos. She was there, and she was like, using her arachnid dough fruit, to use some spider, you know. She was showing like Nico Robin these like images of like Saul and her mother and um who else was there? I think just those two. And Clover too. And fucking with her mind, like, like, it's cool, Robin, we're here for you and other things. And she was like, what? You know, it was fucking with her for a little bit, but then she like broke past it. She eventually used hockey and fuse, and like her double fruit got like an awakening. She used like a double form to like defeat Black Maria. You gotta watch Wano and know what I'm talking about. She used a double form to do that. She became a she double, like kind of like Mira Jane, but not so quite like that. And she did that. She had armament hockey on that shit too. So she basically does know armament hockey. and she defeated Black Maria. Um, she watched as Luffy, she was there with the captain fucking took down Kaido, and he unlocked Sun God Nika and shit. She's like, cool. That's my nigga and stuff. That's my captain and shit. We were on our way towards the One Piece. After she defeated Kaido, he defeated Kaido. He was like, yeah, we are there. The next day and all that extra stuff. They all got new bounties and shit. And her bounty was like, man, 930 something million. Almost a billion berries. Because that girl is a girl. She knows where the poneglyphs are. She knows how to read the poneglyphs. So, they're on the dick. That's what they do. The government and stuff. That's what they do, nigga. Calm down. Watch One Piece. You don't know what I'm talking about. They on cop. Too much. You know. And she was, there, and she was like, damn, oh, we're actually coming up. Then they get to Egghead, and she's like, she finds out from Shaka, one of the satellites, that Saul is alive. That made her happy. She cried, tears of joy. Her friend Saul from way back in the day is still alive. And Vegapunk had been, keeping some of the books that were thrown in the water at Ohara, and some of that shit was recovered, and he was able to find some shit out about the government and shit. But that's why the government was going there to Egghead to fucking kill Vegapunk. They sent the Seraphim and all kind of niggas, CP9 or CP0 and fucking, man, nigga, it's in the next episode's coming out tomorrow. No, fool, it's other stuff. That's Kizaru and fucking Saint Saturn coming to fucking, kill Vegapunk. What does the future have to hold? I know a little bit of stuff, but we ain't talking about that here. The anime's coming back tomorrow. That's why I had to talk about Nico Robin's backstory today. I was gonna not, but then I was like, yeah, I have to. This is my thing, I think, and this is just a little theory that I have. I might make a video eventually, but I think that Nico Robin is Luffy's sister, and I think also that she's the daughter of fucking Dragon. She had him, or he had her with Olvia, a long time ago, before Dragon then had kid with somebody else. They're essentially half brother and half sister. That's what I think. That's a theory. Calm down, y'all. I told you I'd have a theory at the end of this video. Tell me what you think about that. Watch One Piece and tell me that, does that sound cool or does that not sound cool? Because it sounds like it's possible to me. If that happens and shit, I won't be surprised. And if that's the case, then Nico Robin's one of the D's, of the D clan, but through Dragon and shit. So I don't know. If that's how that works, but it does work that way. She has some D blood in her. That's what I think. But that's just me. But stay cool on the corner, anyways. And that's the story of Nico Robin as of right now and shit. There's a lot more story to go with One Piece. Not a lot, but it's still an ongoing series and it's worth you watching. This was the story of Nico Robin. So stay cool on the corner.